So my name is Scott Campbell, and I primarily study the social uses and consequences of mobile communication. And I think that I want to start off by underscoring what, for me, is the biggest takeaway from Professor Katz's talk, which is that technology itself is not good or bad. It depends on how we use it. However, right now, I think there's a lot of moral panic in the popular press and in academia about mobile phone addiction, about especially young people, but people in general being addicted to their smartphone is a message that I'm seeing a lot these days. And what I want to do in this talk is to offer you an alternative framework for thinking about and talking about some of the problems that are being observed with smartphones today, and young people and older people too now. Okay? So first, before I get into that, I want to address what I think is unique about mobile communication. If I'm going to study mobile communication, I should have a reason why I'm investing my career in this particular phenomenon. And I've invested my career in this phenomenon because I think it's unique from any other context of media use. It's unique in that the adoption rates of mobile communication are unprecedented, the fastest, most widespread diffusing communication platform ever on the planet. It's also cheap enough so that it is not just a technology for wealthy societies. If you look at what's happening in the global south, that's where the greatest growth is happening right now in terms of mobile communication. Perhaps it's most unique because of the way that it differs from other contexts of media. So a lot of times people like to lump mobile communication in with other forms of wireless communication, such as laptops. But something I want to point out is that mobile and portable are not the same thing. So with portable media, we carry them around with us, like mobile, but we don't use them while we're mobile. We need to find places. We require places to use portable devices. We need an infrastructure. We need a surface, like this surface for this laptop. We need a network to log on to. We're not directly connecting with other people or content with portable media. And this is not a point that's very well recognized, at least in my field. It's meaningful because mobile communication is the first technology that truly provides us direct access to one another. Instead of connecting to each other through a place, like with portable media, we're accessible to each other anytime and anywhere. And to me, this leads to the last bullet point I want to stress here is heightened expectations to be accessible to one another. And now with smartphones, we have heightened expectations to access digital content also anytime, anywhere. But when we're talking about access to other people, we're living at a time where the expectations for us to be accessible to one another are higher than ever before. And I don't think we quite see that. I think this is something that we're starting to take for granted as the technology becomes more embedded into our society and embedded into ourselves. And that is the segue I want to use to get me to my conversation about addiction and other ways of thinking about mobile phone use besides addiction. Incidentally, the phrase here, perpetual contact, is something that Professor Katz came up with in the title of a book that he put together several years ago. And I believe that the phrase perpetual contact really kind of captures the phenomenon that I was talking about in terms of having direct anytime, anywhere access to each other. Okay, so just to illustrate how expectations of accessibility are high, a recent survey shows in the US that 72% of teens feel that they need to immediately respond to texts, social networking messages, and other notifications. At the same time, in the same study, 50% of teens say that they feel addicted to their mobile devices. And this is getting to the point I made earlier. In academia, in the literature, in the popular press, and in everyday conversation, this point keeps coming up, how addicted people are to their mobile devices. I want to question that today. Really? Are people really addicted? Is addiction really the proper framework for thinking about some of the problems we're facing today with smartphones in our lives? If you think about addiction, it's kind of a medical concept. It comes with a lot of medical baggage. There are a lot of criteria that you have to meet. If you tell somebody that they're addicted to something, they think, oh, I have to go to rehab. I have a disease. It's difficult to get people to change their behavior if you're going to use addiction as the way of doing it. And so I kind of want to challenge the sentiment out there that addiction is the way that we can talk about these problems. Okay, so I think that a good place to start is to recognize that, as one of our colleagues, Professor Rich Ling says, one of his quotes in a book that he came out with called Taken for Grantedness, that the new thing about mobile communication is that it's nothing new. What we mean by this is that it used to be new and revolutionary. I'll just give you a quick illustration. When I first got a cell phone, I worked in the mobile industry before I went into academia. It's part of the reason why I study this technology, I guess. And I was with a company that launched the first national network, mobile network, digital mobile network in the United States, and they gave us cell phones. And I had my first cell phone. It was the 1990s. I was in my 20s, and I'm driving around in my car, and I get a call from my sister. Oh, okay. Hello? And I go through a red light, okay? I'm not paying attention. I'm on the phone, and I blow a red light, and a police officer pulls me over. And I say, I'm sorry, officer, I'm on the phone with my sister. I'm going to let her go. And he says, oh, that's okay. And he gives me a warning and says, be more careful, and he lets me go. Because the cell phone was new. He didn't know what to make of it. He'd never encountered this before. We weren't texting and driving and having accidents and all of that. It was a new phenomenon, and the police didn't know how to deal with it, so they just let me go. That would never happen today because it's not new. We're used to it now. We've become accustomed to the technology. It has become, according to Professor Ling, embedded into our very social structure now. It's not new and revolutionary. It's almost like telling time. It's almost like the expectation of having transportation to get around. You know, you have to be able to tell time. You have to be able to get around. Otherwise, you're a problem for other people. If you don't have access to mobile communication today, you're a problem for other people. Actually, this is the Jim Katz principle, right? Yeah. Okay, and so Professor Ling, in his book, I'm not going to go through all of these steps. He's a sociologist, like Professor Katz, and sociologists are primarily concerned about social structures. And so Rich Ling is writing about these different processes that we go through to get to the place where mobile communication is embedded into our social structure, kind of like mechanical timekeeping is embedded in our social structure. We take it for granted that everybody tells time. We take that for granted, right? We now take it for granted that mobile communication is a universal thing. Okay, so that's the sociological perspective. I want to talk a little bit about psychology. I'm a communication scholar, so I kind of bridge sociology and psychology. And that's what I'm trying to do now, is to demonstrate in some of my current papers that the embedding in our social structure that Professor Ling writes about in his book is also happening in our cognitive processing. In other words, mobile communication is becoming embedded in our psychology as a part of who we are. It's moved from the foreground as something new and exciting. When you first got a cell phone, you're really fascinated with it, and you're trying to figure out, do I put it in this pocket or that pocket, or, it's new, right? It's not like that anymore, right? It's become a natural part of who we are. So my question, I guess, is it really useful to think of this as an addiction, or maybe is it more useful to think of this as a habit? There's a difference. Habits are not necessarily bad. I don't know of any good addictions, but not yet anyhow. Habits are both good, and they can be good or they can be bad. We need habits in daily life. If anybody plays a musical instrument, they know that having a habit of practice and building that muscle memory is so helpful. We wouldn't want to have to relearn how to use a stapler every time we pick up a stapler, right? It needs to be a routine taken for granted. We don't have to think about it to make life easier. And I think mobile communication has become habitual. Something that we used to think about a lot when it was new, and now we don't think about it so much. Like if you wear a watch. A lot of people don't wear watches anymore. But for those of you who do wear a watch, you think about checking your watch. That's a very natural thing. You don't have to think about it, right? It's a very natural thing to do. You have no idea how often you check your watch because it's a habit, Mobile communication is like this. Okay, I think habit is more useful. I'll show you guys. I think habit is a more useful framework for thinking about this, and we'll give you some examples. First of all, phantom vibrations, okay? How many of you have experienced a phantom vibration? You know what that means? 88% of you should be raising your hand right now, according to this study. Or maybe you don't know what a phantom vibration is. It's when you think you felt your phone beckon you, and you check your phone. Okay, so phantom vibrations to me, it's called, by the way, phantom vibration syndrome. The word syndrome is interesting. The word syndrome means we don't really know what this is, right? So we all have, different health syndromes. It means you have a problem, but the doctors can't explain it. I think that we should not call this phantom vibration syndrome. I think that we should recognize that this is a product of the technology becoming deeply embedded in our cognition, right? Like other things in everyday life. Let's move on to texting while driving. The habit of texting while driving. I have a little bit more concrete evidence that habit works as a framework for explaining problematic mobile phone use. Okay, so I did some work with a graduate student to try to explain texting while driving. All of the work that had been done to explain texting while driving so far had emphasized the conscious choices that we make and tried to understand why people consciously choose to text while drive and how they can change their mind. That's what previously had been done to explain and fix the problem. My graduate student and I started thinking about habit. So what if some of the problem can be explained by the fact that people take their mobile devices for granted and that they're deeply embedded and now habitual? In other words, habit means that you don't think so much, you don't have to think so much about what you're doing. I don't know if this word translates into Spanish, but automaticity, automatic, habit means you do something a little bit automatically. You think less about it, okay? So these are some items that we used to try to create a new concept, the habit of texting, and asked people, to what extent they have this habit. And we did a survey, and we found that this habit significantly explains sending and receiving text messages while you're driving, reading text messages and sending text messages while you're driving. In other words, there's evidence. This isn't the entire explanation. It's one piece of the puzzle, one significant piece of the puzzle, not the entire explanation. But it is important because it demonstrates that that maybe the solution is to emphasize mindfulness. So I guess what I'm trying to stress here is the importance of mindfulness when we start taking our devices for granted, and we start taking our ability to connect with content and each other for granted. I think it's an indication that I don't think the entire world needs to go to cell phone rehab. I think we all need to be a little bit more mindful about what we're doing, and I think that that's an easier way of getting people to change their behavior, okay? I'm going to make one more point here about why the habit of mobile communication is important and why mindfulness is important. Okay, so moving on from phantom vibrations to texting and driving to something else that I think is kind of an emergent concern regarding mobile communication and mobile communication habits, and that's solitude. Okay, solitude is characteristically defined as being alone. So, mobile communication and other digital technologies have seriously challenged solitude in many ways. Not just how we experience solitude, but even the concept of what solitude is. The concept of solitude was established well before mobile communication and the internet. The concept of solitude in psychological research is rooted in being physically together with other people. I guess I should take a step back and say that first of all, I'm sorry, I should mention this, solitude is both good and bad, right? Not everybody needs more solitude in their lives. There are a lot of elderly people that live alone and shouldn't have more solitude. There are a lot of young people, though, that don't get enough solitude. Solitude is important for our development. It's important for creativity. It's important for centering ourselves in spirituality. And it's important to give us perspective, to take a step back from the social situations of our life and to have some perspective so that we can deal with people more constructively. So solitude can lead to loneliness, but it has a lot of benefits. So we don't want to lose solitude, okay? But right now, the way that solitude is conceptualized is entirely about physically being with other people. And this is a problem because, as you know, when we connect like this, we connect like this, however we're connecting with other people, it can be a real connection, right? There are people that fall in love online. There are people that carry out their personal relationships via mobile communication when you have to live apart from your spouse, right? And you're using these devices to connect, right? That can be a real connection. Even if you're not physically together, you're still with somebody. This is not recognized in psychology because nobody's done any work on solitude, really, since the 1990s. So, mobile communication requires us to rethink, first of all, what solitude is and how we can measure it, because the measurements are all rooted in face-to-face interaction. But it also has implications for the way that we experience solitude. I think there are two flavors of solitude. There's the unintended solitude that happens when you just happen to be alone. You didn't plan on it. You find yourself walking down the street all by yourself, or you're just accidentally by yourself. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable, right? And I think that that's where people pull out their mobile device, is sometimes they want to fill in the dead time of being alone, or maybe they feel bored, or maybe they feel uncomfortable, right? And so they kind of automatically, again, like a habit, automatically turn to their cell phone. I do it all the time. If I have a moment by myself, I check my text messages, of course. The other flavor of solitude is deliberate, where we carve out time to spend by ourselves. So the implication here is that with digital media, unintentional solitude is no longer mandatory. It used to be mandatory. We as human beings used to have to be comfortable being by ourselves, sometimes. It's not required anymore. So I guess the point I want to land on is, because of the embedding of mobile communication and being accessible anytime, anywhere, we need to really stress and emphasize the importance of deliberate solitude now that unintentional solitude is no longer mandatory. Okay, so what I tried to do here was lay out some of the problems of smartphone technology today that are being addressed in academia and in the press. Again, I don't think that the technology itself is bad, and I think that addiction is not a very useful framework. So I'm trying to offer you a different way of thinking about how we can change our behaviors and increase mindfulness to address some of the problems that people are talking about today with mobile communication. And I really appreciate your time listening today. Gracias.